Well, thanks everyone for joining us. You should be able to see a couple of questions up on the screen, which we've prepared ahead of your breakout rooms, which you might have seen in the email reminder we sent around. Um, the idea of this is just to get you thinking about sort of the challenges you're already facing or anticipate facing in fundraising, and to give you a chance to discuss this with other people as well. And that will just take up sort of the first 5 minutes of this session or so, which we'll get started with shortly. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us today. I think it should be a really interesting and somewhat interactive session on fundraising. We're delighted to be joined by Shara and Natasha today, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, and who will be discussing topics such as common challenges in fundraising, how to craft compelling funding bids, and building relationships with funders. Um, Before we begin, please do pop your names and organizations in your Zoom profiles. And if you're comfortable putting your cameras on, please do so, especially for the breakout rooms and Q&A segment of this event. We are recording this session and we'll upload that onto the website afterwards, as well as the digital guide, which summarizes the key learnings from today. As I mentioned, we're delighted to be joined today by Natasha, who is the Environmental Group's Programme Lead at the Environmental Funders Network, or EFN, as well as Shara, who is a Senior Associate at the European Climate Foundation, or ECF. Natasha will start us off today by discussing key takeaways from EFN's recent report, where the green grants went, and that will be followed by Shara's presentation that will look more at what funders think and need from you. In terms of format, we'll be kicking off with the breakout rooms, followed by both presentations and then audience Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so of the session, before you all head off to watch the Chancellor's spending review at 12:30. Well, Natasha, do you want to kick us off then?
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Nadia. And yeah, really great to be here and had a really interesting discussion in the breakout space that I was in. I think generally it's a really challenging time for fundraising and lots of interesting things sort of on the horizon. So yeah, conversation might sort of delve into some of that. But I thought I'd start by kind of giving a bit of an overview just about the Environmental Funders Network and sort of what we exist to do, which is pretty simple. There's three main goals to our work. One is expanding environmental philanthropy. So that's simply about growing the pie, increasing the flow of funds that's entering the sector. The second is around improving the effectiveness of that environmental philanthropy. So even if we did have all of the money that we needed, if that money is not given in a way that's effective, sometimes it can even cause more harm than good. So we're sort of banging the drum for things like trust-based giving, unrestricted giving, multi-year grants, et cetera, et cetera. And then the third area is supporting environmental groups. And that's the strand of work that I look after specifically at EFN. So I run something called the Green Fundraisers Forum, and our goal is to kind of pour into the sector in terms of resource and training and convening, to try and enable environmental fundraisers to essentially do their work in a way that feels really effective. We've got a few approaches to this. So we do research and produce kind of research publications. We run convenings. A big part of our work is bringing people together, both in person and online. We run informational talks and training sessions, field trips. We have a kind of annual retreat and a few away days that we run as well. Great. So next slide, please. So one of the key pieces of research that we produce every few years is called Where the Green Grants Went. And essentially that forms the basis of a lot of our program because it gives us a bit of a bird's eye perspective on what exactly is happening in terms of the big picture in environmental philanthropy. So this piece of work analyzes the whole philanthropic sector and looks at the flow of funds in terms of environmental giving. So if you go to the next slide, I'll sort of give the headlines of what we found. The most recent report was published last year, but just to note that the data is from the year 2021 to 2022, because there's always a bit of a lag in terms of the information being published, et cetera, et cetera. So we're always a few years out, but this is the most recent information that we can go off. The report analysed 6,555 grants from a split of UK trusts and foundations and UK lottery funders. There were exactly 238 funders that were analysed. And what the work found is that the total amount in grants that was given to environmental causes was £687.2 million, which encouragingly is a huge increase compared to previous reports. But when you sort of look at the scale in terms of what proportion of the total philanthropic funding available is going to environmental causes, it's less than 10%, it's 8.5%. So good news is that's increased a lot from previous years, but those of us who work in the sector recognize the scale of the ecological crisis that we're in, and sort of less than 10% of the total philanthropic funding does not feel enough in order to sort of resource what needs to actually change in order for us to change the trajectory that we're on. The current average grant size is 104,832, which again is a big increase from the previous year, which was £60,000. But I think that sort of figure probably looks very unfamiliar to most of you. And that's for good reason, because this is highly skewed by a small number of very, very large foundations that give huge grants. So actually, when we look at the median grant size, it's more like £10,000. And actually, when we break that down again, I think most organisations will be getting very, very small amounts, probably less than £4,000. So it seems to be a kind of scattergun approach in terms of what most funders are doing, spreading the money quite thinly across a large group of organisations. Okay, next slide. So who are the big funders? These are the largest 10 environmental funders in the funding in the UK. And the ones that have a green dot beside them are the funders that have sort of previously been on this list. They're consistently in the top 10. The ones without the green dot are the kind of newer funders to the space. And these 10 organizations have a huge amount of sort of power within the sector, because actually they represent about 80% of the total environmental funding that is going out. Their average grant size is £1 million. Again, so it sort of explains the skew, and the remaining sort of 80, the remaining 380 organizations, the average is about £33,000. So you can see sort of a quite big split between these huge funders making massive grants versus the majority that are sort of making much smaller grants. Next slide, please. So this is probably more of an accurate visual representation of what organizations are actually experiencing on the ground, which is the vast majority of you are receiving small amounts of funding. So you can see that 50% of the grants are less than £10,000. And when you break that down, the majority are under £3,500. So that sort of gives you an idea of the spread. We do sort of call this approach very sort of scattergun, spreading it very thinly, and tends not to be, when you look at the bigger picture, the most effective way to kind of fund change. So yeah, bit of work to be done here in terms of the strategy overall for the environmental philanthropy sector. Next slide. So in terms of the thematic distribution, which areas is this money going towards? We've split that into kind of 12 areas roughly to see the issue area that the money is going to. Right at the top kind of way in the lead is climate and air quality. Again, this is where the biggest increase has been in recent years. And this is what the big funders tend to be focused on, is the climate issue area, followed by trade and finance, and then terrestrial ecosystems and land use and energy. At the bottom, we call these issue areas the kind of Cinderella issues. They're consistently underfunded, but actually, if you look at what they're doing, these are some of the key drivers of environmental change and feel hugely important to be funded. So at EFN, we do quite a lot of work championing those sort of bottom 5 issue areas: toxics and pollutions, freshwater consumption and waste, coastal and marine ecosystems, because feels very important that they receive more funding and are better resourced. It's also interesting if you look at the differences between kind of international and UK funding, because UK funding has a very different order. The money that's staying in the UK tends to go towards biodiversity and species preservation, as well as terrestrial ecosystems and land use and transport and agriculture. So a very different spread at the top, but at the bottom, it's the Cinderella issues that are still being largely underfunded. Next slide. So this is a bit of a picture of the global distribution of foundation grants. And I guess the main thing to note is that the trend over time has been for a lot more of the funding that is coming out of the UK to be going to international work. And that is largely because the big funders, again, are tending to prioritize international grants. So actually, overall, the amount of funding available to UK organizations has actually increased. But overall, the biggest increase has been to international organizations and international work. Next slide. And then this is the picture in the UK. So the distribution is actually fairly uneven, with the east of England having the least amount of funding, which is, sort of interesting when you look at it in this way. And this is the last slide sort of that goes into some of the key findings of this report. Very, very top line, rushing through it because I've only got 10 minutes or so. But if you're keen to kind of dive deeper into the data, I will pop a link to the full report in the chat. But yeah, really sort of interesting if you want to sort of get down into the nitty gritty. And if you go on to the next slide, obviously I wanted to sort of share that big picture overview because I think it can be so helpful to understand what's going on that large scale and where your work kind of fits into that. But also wanted to give you a little bit of kind of practical support as well, and things that can kind of help you with your day to day. So we run something called the Green Fundraisers Forum, and we've got just over 1,000 environmental fundraisers that are kind of part of that. And we don't want to create any sort of exclusivity. You do not have to join our club. We would love to have you as part of it, but we want to make as many of the resources kind of publicly available to anybody. So I particularly wanted to point out 2 resources that will hopefully help you in your day-to-day work. One is a funding opportunities database, which we regularly update. And that essentially is compiling all of the environmental funding that we come across. If we see a new fund opening, we'll pop it on the spreadsheet, and it tends to be updated sort of about every 2 weeks. And you can organize it by category. So a specific like area of work that you're looking for funding for, but we want to reduce the amount of time that you are spending kind of looking for the funders, and centralize that as much as we can. So again, I'll pop that link in the chat. And then the second piece of work that will hopefully be useful is the resources for environmental fundraisers. So we've essentially tried to put everything in one place. So the training sessions that we put on for environmental fundraisers, any links to interesting articles or videos or reports, we pop on there as well. So again, I'll share that with you. Next slide. Again, I said we want to sort of make all of this stuff as available to everybody as possible. But if you do want to be more involved with the Green Fundraisers Forum, we'd be very welcoming of that. And basically, all you need is to have environmental fundraising kind of be a core part of your role. This is a picture from last week where we gathered a group of 30 environmental fundraisers at the Natural History Museum to kind of collectively discuss how we could drive more funding into the environment sector. And we really kind of believe in the power of in person and online, but just convening groups to increase collaboration. And I think there's sort of a real recognition that fundraising can be incredibly isolating. I was a fundraiser for 10 years before this role, and definitely felt at times like I was really in a silo. But having groups and communities that you can go to kind of ask questions and get a sense of the bigger picture can be a real boost and just really, really helpful. And sort of in terms of the bottom line, I think it really, really fruitful because although fundraising is sort of seen to be a really competitive space, actually every environmental fundraiser I've come across has been really open, really forthcoming, really friendly. So I think one of the biggest things that we'd love to encourage you all to do is sort of find those communities of fundraisers to kind of share your knowledge and your experience with. But I'll leave it at that, and I'm looking forward to having more of a chat and answering questions. And I'll pop those resources in the chat as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natasha. It's really, really interesting, especially to see where all the funding's actually going. Shara, would you like to start your presentation?
Great. Thank you. And thanks, Natasha. That was really helpful for me to kind of listen to as well. So hi, everyone. I'm Shara. As Nadia said at the beginning, I'm a senior associate in the UK programme at the European Climate Foundation. I look after our grant making in the UK, kind of focused leading our work on land use and industry and some other kind of sector areas. I work with quite a diverse group of partner organisations, from kind of political advocacy to public campaigning. Just in case you haven't heard of us before, ECF is a philanthropic initiative. We work with over 700 partners to catalyse climate action, with a mission really to kind of empower people across society to create a net zero world. For this conversation, I thought it also might be quite helpful to note here that ECF is what they call in the philanthropic world a strategic regranter. So if you haven't heard of that term before, that means that we operate slightly differently to other foundations because we don't have our own endowment. We rely on money from foundations, which comes to us, and then we strategically redeploy based on our strategy. So I just thought it would be helpful to kind of say that up front in case you've not heard that term before. So on the screen, you can see some of the things I'll cover in the next 10 minutes or so. What I would say, and I think it's important to caveat this up front, is this is very much what I like to see. But every funder, every foundation is different. Everyone has their own style. So I'm saying, please take everything I say with a pinch of salt. And also to note, there is a kind of range of experience in this room today. So apologies in advance if some of this is kind of what you do on a day-to-day basis, but I wanted to make sure that we cover all kind of levels and experiences. So next slide, please, Holly. So to begin with, starting out, how to build an attractive pitch for those kind of first conversations that you have with funders. So I guess the most important thing to say is do as much research as you can upfront before you have those initial conversations. Look at websites, see if you can spot who else they've funded or maybe who they've worked with before from kind of your conversations with others in the space, with your network, and also find out what types of activities the funder that you're approaching tends to be interested in. I appreciate that it's not always easy to see this on websites, but try and see what you can find. But I guess really that kind of first conversation that you have is a really important conversation. Every funder has their own values, their own priorities and expectations. So if you can't research this, be prepared to kind of ask some questions in those initial conversations, just so you get a bit of a feel for kind of where their priorities are. But I guess as you can see on my slides here, in those initial conversations, we also really want to learn from you because you're actually the experts. So tell us in that conversation, you know, what opportunity have you spotted? What is your take on how to fix some of these really knotty problems that we're dealing with when we're talking about the climate and nature challenges? Why do you think now is the right moment to influence? Why your organization? What is your unique selling point? We really learn a lot from those initial meetings with you. I guess the other thing to say is it's not always very clear, I understand, about the kind of process that different foundations have. Some foundations are quite informal with kind of multiple meetings throughout the year when you can put proposals into. Others have quite strict application timelines via open calls and invitations. So make sure you kind of get as much information as you can in any kind of conversations that you have with people. I've noted here that I think it's quite important, I think, to remember that not every funder that you speak to is going to fit your organization's priorities. And I think try not to force something that doesn't quite strategically align, because I think it's not necessarily going to be helpful for you in the long run either. What I would say is, you know, even if you don't have success with that particular funder, don't be disheartened. The conversation is never a waste. It just might not be the right fit at that moment. So really try and go into all of those conversations with an open mind. And I think it was Ben who said in the kind of questions on the chat about being introduced to funders. If you do have a conversation with a funder and it doesn't necessarily fit for whatever reason, we also speak to each other. So we may know of a funder who would be the right fit for you, or we are able to kind of make an introduction if we think that we can see a potential kind of partnership in another space. So that's why I'm saying, yeah, don't be disheartened if it doesn't work out. There are other kind of avenues that you can explore there as well. Next slide, please. So what makes a good proposal? So I'm taking it here as you've been invited to submit a proposal and an application. Congratulations. I think the most important thing to do and to remember, and this is super basic, but communicate clearly. You are the expert and you understand the detail, but me and others in this working in our roles, we may only have a kind of high level knowledge of the particular area that you're working in. So we really rely on you to explain it to us and explain it simply. I often see proposals that have been written as if they're like an internal document or an internal strategy. And so I guess it's really important to say and just remember when you're writing, we don't work in your organization. So don't assume knowledge and explain things in kind of everyday English. So make sure you avoid any of that kind of internal shorthand that you might use. It's so easily done, but I do see proposals where I'm like, I wish I understood your acronym, but I don't work in your organization. So that's quite hard for me to kind of understand. On there, you can see I've said, in my experience, a good proposal does kind of two things really clearly. So firstly, it explains the why. So describe why this grant or this project is going to equal change in the real world. What are the kind of concrete outcomes that you're aiming for? And I think be really ambitious here as well. And then explain the how. So what activities do you need to carry out to achieve those outcomes? What I would say here is that one of the things that we do tend to see is having very ambitious kind of objectives, but then not matching the kind of proposed activities as a clear kind of link to achieving them. So really think through how the activities that you're setting out are going to help you achieve those kind of overall outcomes. The other thing I've noticed at the bottom, noted at the bottom here is tell us who else you plan to be working with or who else you are working with. I think this is really important for funders, particularly for funders who are already granting organizations in the space. It's helpful for us to kind of know how the ecosystem is working. It's helpful for us to know who you think are the organizations that you would want to kind of collaborate with and partner with, because we may be able to spot gaps or opportunities to kind of link you up with other people and facilitate introductions. And it's also helpful for us to know if our strategy is working as well. Next slide, please. Communicating. So I think the main thing I would say here on kind of communicating with your funder from beginning to end really is have those conversations right up front about how that funder wants to communicate with you, particularly throughout the grant period, because again, like I said at the beginning, everyone is quite different. For me, I quite like it when I have quite regular conversations with the partners that I work with. I love seeing updates in real time about the stuff that you're doing because I can't know everything that you're doing. So I really like it when people drop me an email with like a link to something or a news article that they've been in. But I would say that it might not be the case for everyone. So be really respectful of people's time. Some people may not have the capacity to have regular contact with you. So really do establish that at the beginning, keep things very purposeful and very action orientated. All funders will have a kind of reporting schedule for you to follow. So just kind of discuss that up front and have that really clear in your mind. One of the things that we thought it would be helpful to cover is how to communicate when things aren't going so well. And I think this is really important, and I'm really pleased that the team asked this question. I think as a funder, I really appreciate hearing honest reflections, both about successes, but also for your failures as well, so that we can learn and develop together. And I think increasingly in this like very challenging and turbulent political world, things are going to crop up that are unexpected. So what I would say here is, again, this is a kind of personal preference, but I would much rather people don't wait to a reporting moment to tell me if something isn't working out as planned. I really appreciate it if people are kind of open and transparent. As a funder, I'm also here to help and advise and just kind of be an ear to you if there's challenges that are going on. So I think have that kind of open and honest communication. And I think, as I said at the bottom here, this is a two-way relationship. So make recommendations to us, give us advice, give us feedback. We really want to know how you found things as well. We want to know what you think and also how we can kind of learn and improve as we go as well, because we are also figuring out the same things. Next slide, please. So impact and success. I think what's important to say here is we really understand that particularly measuring the kind of success of advocacy and political campaigns can be really tricky. We often rely on qualitative data and narrative to explain how certain outcomes have been reached. And that's not easy to do, particularly compared to kind of like quantitative data. So a process that we often use actually internally as a team is the what, so what, now what, that some of you may have come across before from Terry Borton. It was a kind of facilitation technique that was used in the 1970s. But I think it's actually really helpful and kind of forces you to do a bit of reflection. So think about what happened, describe the events of the fact, then use that so what to really analyze and sense make and kind of draw insights from events. And then do the now what. So apply the lessons for the next time. I think having that period of reflection is really useful, not just at the end of a grant, but I think actually if you periodically do reflective moments throughout the process, it can really help you define and kind of think about the impact of the work that you're doing, and kind of what that's measuring up to in the real world as well. And so I guess the final thing I would say on this is at the end of the grant period, I think funders always really want to know what you've learnt, whether that's you've identified a policy gap, whether you found a new opportunity. You might have spotted that there's parts of the climate movement that really need support. And I think it's really helpful to kind of tell us that, and we can think about that as we evolve our strategies and our priorities going forward as well. Next slide, please. So my final takeaways, my kind of top 5 things I would say if you're going to remember anything from what I've just said. The first one, start with a conversation, do your research, understand that foundation's priorities and how that might align with the work programme that your organisation has. Keep it simple at every stage. I know this sounds so obvious, but as someone who reads a lot of funding proposals, please make sure that someone external to your team and organisation can understand your proposal. Particularly when you have a kind of technical expert writing the proposal. 3, focus on impact. So have a really clear idea of the impact that you think your work will be, not just a kind of long list of outputs that you will produce as part of a project. 4, respect people's time. I've given you a good flavour of how I like to communicate, but not everyone will have the time and capacity to kind of do that. So just have that conversation as early as you can. And then 5, I think really important, be transparent. We know that things change internally, externally, but I think upfront communication is so important. And we really value your kind of honesty and open communication, particularly about challenges, which I know is not easy to have a conversation about that, but I think you can always learn so much from that as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Shara. Really, really interesting, and appreciate your honesty on many of those points. So we are in the Q&A part of the session, and so if you'd like, please do stick your hands up, or if you prefer to pop a question in the chat, that's fine as well. But I will just kick us off with a question to both of you, which is how do we prevent climate causes from being the first to have funding cut in funder rollbacks? Perhaps, Natasha, do you want to take that first to give Shara a breather after her presentation?
Yeah, sure. Can you ask the question again? I just want to make
Yeah,
sure.
of course. How do we prevent climate causes from being the first to have funding cut in funder rollbacks?
It's a good question, and it's one that we're really keen to kind of prevent at EFN as well. It's interesting that the trend has very much it's not going that way. So, for example, when we're looking at our data, it's actually the biggest area of growth. It's still a tiny proportion of the total amount of philanthropic funding, but it is growing. So thankfully, it doesn't appear that that's happening, but there's a huge amount more work that can be done. Another piece of work that we did recently was around engaging with the gatekeepers of wealth. So wealth advisors, philanthropy advisors, lawyers, etc. And we kind of asked what the barriers were for people who were apparently, all the clients are sort of citing climate change as one of the biggest concerns that they have. But then they weren't sort of taking that step to start funding that work. So we asked what the barriers were. And interestingly, like at the top of that was overwhelm, a sense of overwhelm and sort of not understanding the bigger picture and the complexity of the sector. There was also a bit of confusion just about like where to start. And also amongst some of them, it felt like a risky thing. It felt very politicized, and they were worried also within that sentiment about being kind of called out for hypocrisy as well, which is all really interesting to kind of understand the psychology of it. So I think as environmental fundraisers, I guess our role is really kind of telling the story, and trying to where we can uh, enable those sort of access points. I mean, at the Environmental Funders Network, we always say one of the best places to start is by funding those kind of Cinderella issues, the things that are really underfunded, because that's a good gap that new funders can fill, for example. But I think it's really about making it accessible, kind of telling the story, and all of the things that Shara shared in her presentation. But it is definitely a priority, and especially with the wealth transfer that you might have heard about. Essentially, older funders, a lot of them are handing over the control of their wealth to their children. And they tend to be more interested in climate change and the big kind of social justice questions as well. So that also feels like an opportunity to sort of engage this more interested group of new funders as well.
Thanks. Shara, do you have anything to add to that bit?
Yeah, I agree with everything Natasha said. I guess the things that I would add, and this is very much a UK kind of focus as well, but I guess um, how we demonstrate that climate really connects to the wider political, economic, and social kind of challenges that the government are grappling with, that everyone in society is kind of managing and working on at the moment, I guess is the most important way of demonstrating why we shouldn't be moving away from funding kind of climate related issues. So I think, you know, in the UK, we spend a lot of time thinking about the impact of climate and nature, but also the opportunities that that will give to the UK. In the UK, you know, the focus is so much on growth and growth opportunities. So how can we kind of leverage that kind of passion and area of interest to demonstrate that climate is an area where there is growth and opportunity? So I think it's really about connecting it to some of the wider kind of political, economic, and social issues that all decision makers are grappling with all over the world.
Fantastic, thanks. I have another question based on sort of some of the reflections from the breakout rooms, which was how do you encourage grantees about sharing challenges without grantees then fearing that they will then have future funding cut? Would either of you like to take that question?
This is such a complicated one, and one that I feel quite passionate about as somebody who worked as a fundraiser for 10 years. And and I know, Shara, that you're totally meaning what you say, but I noticed as well that there were so many funders being like, tell us, you know, give us the honest feedback. And actually, it can be really difficult because you feel like you're in the position of jeopardizing your organizational's sort of bottom line. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that we're hoping to be able to facilitate at EFN, because we're not a grant maker. So that kind of power imbalance isn't well, it's always there, but we're hoping that we can kind of be a voice for environmental fundraisers as a collective. So we produced a kind of dynamics between funders and fundraisers report and what the barriers are. And we are trying to sort of host lots of gatherings and events and sessions to kind of bring the two groups together in a way that feels like the conversation is happening at a bigger level rather than kind of one-to-one, and putting you in a position where you feel like you might strain the relationship. So yeah, I think we're always happy to gather that collective feedback and sort of provide that for the sector as a whole. But it's a really, really tricky one to navigate. But I think in general, funders are really interested in getting that feedback, and most are quite genuine in that response. And I think they're more suspicious when everything seems to be all perfect all the time, and actually they know that that's not the reality on the ground. So I think yeah, being a bit confident in having those conversations and trusting that relationship is also important.
Thanks, Natasha. Do you have anything to add, Shara?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I would just say that um we are really aware of the power imbalance, and I know that that is a real challenge, which is why I think building strong relationships with the partners that I work with, I hope, helps us have kind of those honest conversations throughout our kind of relationship and project, or whatever that looks like. But we are very aware and kind of conscious of that. Um, I guess like in a really like practical way, um, if you're bringing a kind of challenge or issue to the table, it's always really helpful to have those kind of solutions or ideas that you have about how to pivot or how to kind of take things forward in a different direction. And I think being open to having, I hope all funders are kind of open to having that conversation. But as Natasha said, I know that it is a challenge, and hopefully organisations like EFM can help, kind of, yeah, help improve learnings on this as well. But it's something that we're very conscious of, and are always kind of reflecting and thinking about as well.
How do funders decide when to provide cooperation or support to an organisation? What are the criteria and tips on building towards this kind of giving? Maybe Shara, would you like to take that one for the last minute or so?
Yeah, I can, and I guess it's very specific to the foundation. So it's a little bit hard to give a kind of general statement. But I guess what I would say is a kind of overall trend is that funders are looking to provide this type of support. And there's very much a kind of live conversation in philanthropy about the benefits of giving kind of core funding versus kind of project-based funding. But I think it depends. It depends on quite a variety of factors. Like, for example, at ECF, we only do 1 year grants as a kind of maximum because of the way that we receive our funding. So it's not always the most appropriate to do it. Sometimes it's helpful to do kind of project-based funding. I guess it's also dependent on whether the grant or the organization work is to respond to a kind of particular political moment versus like provide long-term sustainability to an organization. So it's really dependent on a lot of factors. But what I would say is this is definitely a kind of live conversation between funders at the moment, and wanting to kind of move to that model. But of course it takes time, and everyone's at different stages of that journey and in that conversation. And I guess there's probably difference of opinion, I would say, Natasha, in terms of what some of the big funders think about that type of funding support.
Definitely. And I know we're at time, but just to say, I've also heard from quite a few funders that sometimes they say repeatedly, we want to make unrestricted grants. And I don't think organizations believe them because actually they don't, they still receive project proposals. And it's really interesting. And you can't really expect anything different because I think the whole sector has been trained on packaging everything as a project because that's what funders have always wanted. So it's a real difficult space to navigate. But I would say if a funder does say that they'll consider that, believe them, put that forward. And it's just about really demonstrating the strength of your organization and your organization strategy, vision, leadership, capacity to kind of hold that trust and hold those bigger long-term unrestricted grants. Yeah, it's more about vision rather than narrowing it down to a specific project and outcomes.
Amazing. Thanks, Natasha. Really, really enjoyed that discussion, and appreciate tackling some really tricky questions there as well. But yeah, thank you both, Shara and Natasha, for delivering this session for us, and thanks everyone for attending. We will be uploading the recording afterwards, as if you'd like to share that with any colleagues or watch it back, as well as a digital guide, and we'll be sending around a feedback survey as always. But yes, big thanks again, and hope everyone enjoys watching the spending review. And see you all soon. Thanks, everyone.